You are listening to Inspired Caring with Michelle Magner, episode number 163. Hello, welcome to Inspired Caring. I'm your host, Michelle Magner. If you are caring for an older family member, this is the podcast for you. Each week, I bring insight, tips, inspiration, and strategies to help you care for the people that you love without losing yourself along the way. Having cared for both of my grandmothers, I've helped manage everything from hospital stays, households full of belongings, to navigating senior living and end-of-life care. And I've worked in senior living as a result of that experience, serving my residents and their families as they've been on this journey too. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoy this episode of Inspired Caring. Today, I am welcoming Michael James to the podcast. He is the author of the book, Dear Judy, A Love Story Rewritten. Welcome, Michael.
Rewritten by Alzheimer's.
Rewritten by Alzheimer's, the most important piece of this. We were just talking about language, and actually it feels like you have to tap into a whole different language when you are communicating with someone that is living with dementia.
For sure. Yeah. The dementia care is so complicated, and we don't generally get any training in how to give care to somebody who's suffering from some form of dementia.
Mm-hmm.
And a huge piece of it is communicating. And as the disease advances, that becomes way more problematic, because not only is the patient or the sufferer losing the capacity to speak, among other losses, but they're also losing the capacity to understand what is being said to them.
Right.
And for the caregiver, that's exceedingly frustrating. And what I learned, and maybe a little later than I wish I had, was that the sense of touch is a dimension of communicating that has to be exploited in dementia care, because that is a sensibility that the sufferer maintains, I would say, right to the end.
Mm.
And I think there's a capacity of touch to soothe and calm and reassure, when words can be provocative,
Mm-hmm.
can even seem aggressive to the sufferer. And I noticed that when my wife was in full-time memory care, as I spent time in her facility, because I made a point of spending at least 2 or 3 hours a day there. And I have to say, she was only in full-time memory care for 5 months before she died.
Mm.
But I would go 2 or 3 times a day. And because it was close to my office, it was convenient. And in interacting not only with my wife, but also with other residents of this memory care home, I found that holding their hands, rubbing their hands, putting an arm around their shoulder got through to them in a way that words did not.
Mm.
And I think that that's something that people who are giving care should keep in mind. In the last recently, in the last few weeks, I've been paying attention to some Facebook groups, caregivers groups that I've joined.
Mhm.
And what it has reminded me of is how different it is caring for a parent than caring for a spouse. The dynamics are extremely different, and the challenges, I think, can be exaggerated because of those differences. Because when you're caring, often, not always, but often, the caregiver of a parent is also the caregiver of a child or children. So they're,
Right.
that sandwich generation, they're sandwiched between two sets of caregiving demands. They often, as I read their posts, seem to me to be drowning in the demands on their time, on their energies, the emotional, psychological demands, plus all the physical demands of, uh, providing food, shelter, uh, all the things that come with any kind of household obligations. And they don't have that kind of intimate relationship that a couple has,
Mhm.
that even in late stage dementia can reveal itself in a way that's what's the right word, in a way that the caregiver can get a sense that what they've done is appreciated. I had moments like that with my wife in the last months of her life. I
Mhm.
think for children, in some ways it's more challenging because they don't have that degree of intimacy.
Right.
There's an intimacy, but it's a different kind of intimacy, and the parent-child hierarchy and dynamic is always there. And so the fact that the parent is becoming a child becomes that much more frustrating for the caregiver. And it's just incredibly tough to fulfill the role of caregiver in a meaningful way and in a satisfying way when the disease puts up walls and you can't break through them, you know?
Right.
So I feel for everybody who's caregiving for somebody with dementia. And I wish that as a society, we had more resources in place for those caregivers because they certainly need it.
Well, I think your book is going to be a great resource for people sharing your own journey, your own experience.
Thank you.
Um, I,
For
yeah,
me, when I started, I'm a book person, obviously, and I went straight to the bookstore once we had this diagnosis, thinking I've got to find out more about this. And I left the bookstore with 2 or 3 books, one of which was the novel Still Alice by Lisa Genova. And I read that book pretty quickly. The fact that it was fiction was a little problematic because although she had experience, as I recall, she had a grandmother or mother that she cared for who had some form of dementia, and this is what prompted the book. I think I'm not positive, but in any event, whatever brought her to writing the story, she wanted to kind of give a picture of what someone goes through who's experiencing this from the inside out.
Mm-hmm.
I found that for me, everything that happened, it was useful to read it in this story, but it wasn't somebody's genuine experience. I was more interested in reading somebody's real experience in real time. And another book I turned to early on was Barry Peterson's book, Jan's Story. And Barry Peterson was a CBS, I think. CBS commentator, program host. He was on CBS Sunday Morning. And he's, he was a media figure, especially back in the 80s and 90s. His first wife, who was also a television person in the Pacific Northwest, came down with, I think it was younger onset Alzheimer's, and he wrote about their experience. And that was more compelling for me because some of the stuff they went through with her diagnosis, etc., mirrored some of the stuff I went through. But he wrote the book before she died, when he had recently placed her in memory care, I believe. And so the story wasn't complete,
Mm.
And as grim as the typical trajectory of the disease is, I wanted to know from the get-go what to expect across time. So my idea when I wrote this book was to give one perspective, give one picture, one narrative that showed the whole trajectory from one couple's diagnosis to the final moments of that person's life, and then a little beyond. And I think that, some people wouldn't want to know the whole picture. They wouldn't want to see that. And it's important to also say that it's one couple's story. It's not all couples' stories. A friend, and I mentioned this in the book, a good friend, a member of this husband caregivers group that I'm part of, he said, and he picked this up from elsewhere, one case of Alzheimer's, one case of Alzheimer's. There's
Right.
no two cases that are alike because the situation within which it takes place is different. And every factor of your life, your background, where you live, socioeconomic status, all of this stuff is part of the whole experience, and either makes it better or makes it more challenging, depending. But this story gives our experience from start to finish, the
Yeah.
good, the bad, the aspirational, the inevitable, all the stuff that plays into a story like this. And I should also say that I acknowledge that my wife and I were socioeconomically well placed to deal with this,
Mm.
because it can be very, very expensive to manage a disease like that, especially in the home. And if you don't have financial resources, if you don't have long-term care insurance, which most people don't have, if you don't live in a community that offers a lot of services, or even some services, and I would say most people living in rural America don't have community services available that will help them with managing the day-to-day at home or getting respite when they need it, etc. If you don't have those kinds of resources, it's just, it can kill the caregivers, and that is often what happens. So I acknowledge that we had financial means. We had sought my wife's diagnosis after she had been denied long-term care insurance. And when she was denied insurance, I said, we have got to figure out what's going on here. Because I knew something was wrong. I had seen signs for a couple of years. And we sought we decided to apply for long-term care insurance because I had in my head, something's not right. Let's get the insurance and then figure it out. Well, it was already too late because her symptoms.
Yeah, I was wondering what the symptoms were. What were the deciding factors that was?
Well, I will say, she started showing signs as early as 2007. Her diagnosis came 2 years later. In 2009, June of 2009, she got a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment. Now, that was the first diagnosis, just simply mild cognitive impairment.
Okay.
But the physician who gave her that diagnosis, at the same moment passed her a packet of medication to try for a month. Take this for 30 days and we'll see how you do. And if you don't have any bad reaction, you can continue. That's all he said. We got home a few minutes later. She opens the packet and the language is all about Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's this, Alzheimer's that.
Oh my gosh.
She was devastated. Well, he had given her, I just went blank on there's two, Namenda is one, but that she went on later. There's an earlier one and I can't think of
I want to say Aricept, but
that's Aricept. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. It was Aricept. And the booklet was obviously written to promote this treatment for the symptoms of Alzheimer's. When you apply for that, at least at that point in time, from the company that we were applying for, they did by telephone, they did an exam, and a mini mental status exam was part of that interview over the phone. And after we both did it independently of the other, the nurse representing the insurance company called me back and said, I'm going to have to come to your home and do a more in-depth exam with your wife. And she said, well, some people do better face-to-face than they do on the phone. So blah, blah. So they came to our home and they did a second and longer exam face-to-face. And then she was denied. Now, those exams were standard, mini mental status exams, or a little more developed mental status exam. And those exams can sometimes go 45 minutes or more. And that was the case, in fact, when we sought the diagnosis, because after she was turned down, that's when I said, we're going to find out what's going on here. And so that's kind of how we came by it.
So you received the diagnosis and she was able to stay home for a really long time. And then how long was she able to stay home, and how did you make the decision that it was time for memory care? What was there a tipping point or a specific situation?
Well, see, I need to explain also that I was employed full-time as an academic. I was, in fact, chair of my department. So I had administrative duties in addition to teaching duties and in addition to research, creative work. And so I was working well more than a 40-hour week. In the first few years from her diagnosis, which was in 2009, so through to beginning of 2013, she was okay at home on her own. I don't think her days were super fulfilling for her, but I felt that she was safe.
Mm-hmm.
She seemed content to be by herself. But then I started noticing signs that she was beginning to become fearful of being alone. And she was beginning to hallucinate a little and think that there had been people in the house and where had they gone and this stuff. And I started having pretty serious concerns about her safety because of several incidents, and I talk about this in the book. So in 2013, I started pushing to bring companions into the home. I had started researching home care organizations, agencies, and I had zeroed in on one where I liked the staff, I liked their attitude, and they agreed that they would help Judy and I find people that Judy could be comfortable with and feel, a level of trust in. But it was a hard sell. She didn't go for this willingly at the start. And in fact, the very first person who came, she rejected her the very afternoon and locked her out of the house.
Oh my gosh.
Because she kept insisting that she didn't need anybody. She didn't want anybody in the house. So I let it go for a number of months. And then I tried again. And in the end, what worked was a little bit of subterfuge. Judy's mother was visiting us. But at that point in time, her mother was still living in Massachusetts, but soon to move to Texas to live with Judy's brother. And she came to visit us for a few weeks. And what I proposed to Judy was, I said to Judy, look, your mother's going to be here. It's going to be a lot for you to handle. I'll get some home care aides to come in and spend time with your mother. And that way you will feel a little bit of relief. And she said, okay, that sounds fine.
Oh gosh.
So that's what we did. Well, the home care people were in on this, and they knew that the point was to try to pull Judy into whatever they were doing. And that's exactly what they did. And Judy liked, in this case, person that I call Lisa in the book. And after the first time that Lisa was in our home with them, Judy said, I really liked her. She can come back. And that was the start of the sort of building the trust. And eventually there were 4 women, they all happened to be women from this agency, who became Judy's regulars for a period of about a year and a half. And she fairly quickly reached the point where she looked forward to their coming. She enjoyed the time they spent together. They each approached it differently and individually. They each tended to do different things with Judy, but she enjoyed all of that. And that was a huge lift. It's a huge relief on me, because then I could be on campus and not be worrying about whether she was safe at home. Now, the qualifier is it's very expensive. And I was, at that point in time, paying $22 an hour
Mm.
for these in-home people. It started out 6 hours a week, very quickly went to 12 hours. And then within a year, we were up to 30 hours a week. Well, if you multiply that, you're talking about almost $700. That's over $2,000 a month out of pocket. I did not have long-term care insurance.
Right.
The average family, the average household with, I think then the average income in this country was about $56,000 a year. Today, it's probably closer to $61,000 or $62,000 a year. That's not enough to spend $2,000 a month on purchasing someone's time to take care of your loved one so you can have a life, or
Right.
at least so you can get some degree of respite. And we were very, very fortunate that I could afford to do that. But it's more the exception probably than the rule. And most, not most, but many caregivers have to give up their employment so that they can be home full time to take care of whether it's a parent or a spouse. Because once they reach the point where they can't take care of themselves, and I mean more than just the activities of daily living, but I mean, keep themselves safe.
Right.
That's a huge challenge in our society. And I don't see any imminent solutions, but
we can't sustain, we can't maintain, we have to shift and change. Like
yeah,
the system as it stands is not set up for what we are dealing with and facing. We had a few, I don't know what the statistics are, the correct statistics, but in the past, like we didn't have the people being diagnosed with these
right,
conditions, these diseases at the rate that we have now. So
right.
we're just in.
Largely because the life expectancy was much shorter.
Right. People just died. They
Yeah,
died.
they died before they get to this point of having a dementia diagnosis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You touched on safety being a qualifier. One of the things that we talk a lot about is safety being an issue for yourself or your loved one, well being for
Mm-hmm.
yourself or your loved one, and health. The health, and you touched on this earlier, that statistically, for someone caring for a loved one that is living with dementia, there's a really high probability that they're going to die first. And that was the
Yeah.
experience we had in our family with my father in law
Mm-hmm.
passing
Mm-hmm.
before
Mm-hmm.
my mother in law.
Right. 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 Yeah.
So you mentioned also in the support groups the difference in the dynamics between children and caring for a parent versus spouses. And it feels like men caring for their wives is an unrepresented group. I think it's rising, but why do you think that is? I have my guess is because of the vulnerability that it takes to be willing to put your story out there, which you've so
I,
beautifully
I,
done.
I wonder it well, I've thought a fair amount about this. I just listened to a podcast last week. I was listening to it while I was out walking the dog, and it was about caregivers and caregiving. I know. It had originally been broadcast on the NPR radio station, radio system, the program On Point, which is produced by WBUR radio in Boston. And it's actually broadcast here in Nebraska on Nebraska Public Media every morning at 9 o'clock, weekdays at 9 o'clock. And they did a program on caregivers, the challenge and costs of caregiving, not exclusively for aging adults, but including for children. But they were talking about the situation where there aren't resources for caregiving, and it isn't understood, or it isn't considered as an economic enterprise that is worth the the society paying for.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly believe that it is. But they talked about, they admitted right at the outset that I can't remember the exact wording, but they essentially said we're going to talk about caregivers as women because most caregivers are well, it's about 60% of caregivers are women, which means that the other 40% are men, and it's not a big percentage difference,
Right.
but it's because socially we've always seen the model of the caregiver being female. And even though we've been through several waves of feminism and supposedly, re-educated ourselves to the equal status of men and women in the society, we haven't really come there completely.
Right.
And women do, in fact, still bear more of the burden of the household and caregiving, especially when there's children and aging seniors involved. But I know from firsthand experience, from my experience and from the experience of men that I know and that I've seen around me who have cared for loved ones with various dementias, men can do it just as well as women. And if men are given a pass on this by family and friends just because of their gender, then that is wrong. They need the same measures of support that a woman would need
Mm-hmm.
in this kind of undertaking, and the more support they get, the better. But they can do it at a very high level, and I've seen that in the devotion and the commitment of the men in my husband caregivers group.
Mm-hmm.
They are equally able to provide really good quality care, and shouldn't be underestimated. So
I love that. You touched on the intimacy and the difference when it is your partner, your spouse, because I think when you are in a relationship with someone for so many years, you pick up on body languages and nuances and expression. And for my mother-in-law, her family, my husband's family spoke sarcasm like a second language. So it got
yeah,
complicated when language started to become a barrier as
yeah,
she had frontotemporal dementia.
yeah.
But I think
Hmm.
this is also part of the complexity, Michael, is that when kids are caring for parents and there's maybe also still the other parent involved, like we don't want to know the intricacies of people's marriages. Like
Yeah.
you are having to insert yourself into all of these dynamics and complexities um, that are frustrating and confusing, or I don't know
Well,
what the other words would be.
when uh, Judy and I were married for 43 years. We had just had our 43rd wedding anniversary when she died. But when she was diagnosed 6 years earlier, we'd been married for 37 years. So we're with each other almost 24/7 for 37 years.
Right.
Married couples are together 24/7. You begin to think for the other person, and certainly you think with the other person. You know them on every level in a deep and profound way that no child ever experiences with a parent, or vice versa.
Right.
And once you push your kids out into the world, once you empty your nest and they fly off, then there's also another kind of distance between the parent and the child, and that may go on for 20 years before the child suddenly finds themselves having to care for this person that they know one way
Mm-hmm.
because of the shared history and the family ties and whatever continuing relationship they've had in the years after they left the nest, but it isn't the same depth and degree of connection that spouses generally share. Now, that's certainly what I'm saying isn't true for every marriage, but
Mm-hmm.
what we would call good and stable marriages, I think this is a degree, a dimension of that is not doesn't exist with parent-child connections.
I totally agree. I look at my dad and my stepmom's marriage, and from the outside
Mhm,
looking in, and they're healthy, 83 and
mhm,
80,
mhm.
one at this point. And um, I don't want to know the intricacies of their marriage. I think as their child, there's five of us, it's a combined family.
Yeah,
It's been really
yeah,
interesting to see how each of us are managing, approaching thought processes with them, with their own aging journey. Like they're in great shape, they're doing really great. But I think time is a funny thing. And we were talking about age before we started recording and how it's confusing a little bit that I'm 52.
mhm,
I think we just get stuck in these periods of time as children. And I think that's what a lot of
yeah,
adult
sure,
children struggle with in these support groups. It's that they are expecting their 89-year-old mother to be thinking and behaving and acting as if their mother is 62. But like,
right,
it's
and
so,
that's not right.
it's just not possible. So,
I
like,
think I want to come back to a question. Remind me in a second. I want to come back to a point you asked me about earlier, which was what was the kind of push comes to shove moment when I decided we had to go.
mhm.
So we'll come to that. But what I was just about to say in regards to what you're saying now, and I've had these two thoughts crossing in my head, and I just lost it, and now I'm trying to retrieve
So
it.
we're talking about like the expectation management, and your parent is 89, they're not 62
Oh,
anymore.
I know. Yeah. This is the huge difficulty in our society is we do not do end of life well. We
Right.
have we have very little experience of end of life generally. Uh, and we fear death and we fear the end zone, but we're all going to land there. It
Inevitably.
isn't, it is not, I've said this many times, no human has survived life.
Right.
And, you know,
A great quote.
well, when you're in your, certainly in your youth, in your young adulthood, the world is your oyster generally. A lot of
Mhm.
people have challenges, but, you know, it's an uphill thing. And then you peak in your 50s, even early 60s. You're on this upward part of your trajectory, the up top part. But then there's a downhill, and it's a different psychic space, it's a different physical space, it's a different social space. It's reinforced or magnified for many people when they retire, quote unquote, from whatever career or whatever employment they had. Uh, and what we need to do far earlier is talk about this trajectory that we're all on and how we want the landscape to look when we're 60, when we're 70, when we're 80, under whatever conditions we face. And we don't, in families, in social circles, we don't talk about these things in a useful way.
Right.
And, there's a lot of denial. And if I, as a parent, this is a little hypothetical, but if I, say to my kids, all right, I want to talk about what happens when I die, and what I want
Mm-hmm.
my final services to look like, and let's figure out what the obituary should contain. And they go, oh, no, come on, when you're fine, you're
Right.
healthy, you don't need to think about things. Come on, be
Yeah.
real.
Well, it's twofold. One is the denial, let's be real. And also, there's a process for you as an aging human. And as I'm studying gerontology, your own experience and what you need as you are fluffing out your legacy
Yeah,
and prepare in preparation for your own self. Like, it's again, it goes back to the kids. It's sort of not about you.
yeah,
Like, it's about,
it's about life.
right.
And everybody experiences this, and it's just, we need to get more comfortable with death. We need to get more comfortable with aging.
Yes.
We all hope that we'll age healthfully and gracefully and with dignity, but our bodies may have other plans, and our circumstances may have other plans. And if we can put things in place, put some things in place far enough in advance that we can maybe have a little more assurance that our final years, months, weeks won't be crisis or chaos, either for us or for those who are caring for us. I'm not really sure how we do this,
Mm.
but it starts with how we think about end of life, because it's a part of every human being's experience. So why not think about it? Why not plan toward it? I wanted to you asked me what was the push comes to shove moment with
Right.
my wife when I decided I had to put her into full-time memory care. Partly it was a combination of things, but the fact that I was up to 30 hours of in-home care, and it still wasn't, I could see it wasn't going to be enough. And I needed to be able to get a reasonably good night's sleep. I was typically sleeping 5 to 6 hours a night. So that was a piece of it. The other piece was her incontinence.
Ah,
And when that happened, when that started, when that became a fact of our life, then I realized that this was the point at which she needed 24/7 care. And so one thing that worked out very nicely for us, and I would suggest this is something others might think about, especially with a family member who is resistant to the idea of leaving their home, as most people, want to age in place and they want to stay, you hear this all the time. The last thing my parent wants is to be put in a nursing home.
mm.
Um, well, I placed my wife in a memory care residence. I did not see it as a nursing home. Well, it wasn't. She wasn't being nursed. She had a safe and pleasant environment with very, very caring, and I would say loving staff members to make sure that her days had some measure of interest and that her conditions were, you know, were good. Um, I This particular memory residence had a day services program, and I enrolled her in that, knowing that, hoping that she would adapt through the 7 or 8 hours a day that she spent there. Sometimes maybe it was up to 9 hours some days. I drop her off after breakfast. I drop her off at the facility, at the residence, and then I'd go to my job. And then at the end of the day, I would come and pick her up at the end of the afternoon. So she'd spend, initially it was a few days. We just started a few days a week. She'd spend, and she didn't reject that. I had brought her ahead of time. We had walked around, done a visit. She'd met some of the people. She didn't raise any objection. Up to that point, before that, she had objected to some other facilities. But at this point now, I think she was, I won't say she was understanding her own needs, but because she wanted to be around people, because she felt safer around people, I think she understood that how she felt when she was with other people was better than how she felt when she was alone.
Interesting.
And so we built that up until finally, within, a few weeks before she moved in full time, she was going every day, including weekends. We would have breakfast together on a Saturday or Sunday morning. We might go for a walk. We might stop at a park, and then I would drop her off. And she'd spend the balance of the day and have her lunch there. And then I'd pick her up at the end of the afternoon. It gave me respite and also helped her sort of plant herself so that when a room in the facility came available, this is another thing people need to keep in mind. Most memory care residences, at least the decent ones and good ones, have waiting lists. You can't wait till you are in crisis. You need to plan ahead. I had gotten us on the waiting lists of 2 facilities, and the one that she did day services in, eventually when a room came available, Judy had been going to day services for over a month. She felt pretty comfortable there. And so what I did was I said, pointing out other residents that she was with all day, you see these people, they all have a room here. And Judy said, they do? I said, yeah, they all each have their own room. They have their things. They have some of their furniture, so they can go back to their room anytime during the day and relax or take a nap. Oh, really? Yeah. Would you like to see her room? Walked her down the hall, showed her the room that had come available, that would be her room. I said, what do you think if we bring some of your stuff here? Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, we should do that. So that was the segue into, within a few weeks of that, she moved in full time. She never rejected it. She never said, I don't want to be here. I want to go. She never once said to me, I want to go home.
Wow.
And I felt very fortunate about that, because a lot of people, many people reject it and are not happy in full-time memory care, or, resist it. And it makes it difficult for everybody. So
It really does. I worked in a memory care here in Omaha for almost 2 years. And I think that the way I've never heard of this approach that you took, because so often, to your point, is it ends up as this chaotic crisis situation where it's an absolute necessity for someone to make that move. But the planning that you did and the foresight and the thought that you put into it for Judy to slide her into a routine and then offer the opportunity for comfort through the day program is so amazing. In my experience, everybody does eventually make the transition.
yes.
The smoothness of it, I think if it is, the background is a threatening situation where you've been threatening someone
Right.
at home, like, you better be careful or I'm going to, all of that energy kind of bundles up and snowballs into the situation. Or if it's a situation where, you've been at home, but now someone has to go to the hospital. Like, what if the caregiver has to go to the hospital?
Exactly. Exactly. And then overnight, their whole world is turned upside down.
Right. So the way that you introduced home health is so reassuring and beautiful. The way you introduced the idea of senior living as an option for both of you, was so
I kind of went
good.
by instinct
Mm,
because I didn't have any past experience. We neither of us had, family members who'd ever had this disease that we were at least aware of and that we witnessed. We didn't have any kind of family history as a model, let's say, or as
mhm,
experience. So it was always trial and error and trying to figure out the best approach, especially in the face of approaches that did not work. And I write in the book extensively about failures in attempts to do day services and so on. And I am a very organized person, and I'm also proactive when I am faced with a problem.
mhm.
My instinct is never to hide underneath a blanket and say, I wish this would go away. If I have a problem in front of me, my reaction typically is, if there's a solution to this problem, I'm going to find it one way or another. And so partly it's a personality piece, but I think it's also logical. Faced with a challenge, we need to be proactive. We need to think, we need to be thoughtful and calculated. Now that reminds me to add that by the time, I'm going to say 4 years less, 3.5 or so years into the progression of her disease, when all these challenges that I was dealing were beginning to kind of concentrate in a not good way. I found a therapist, and it was a therapist who had experience with both caregivers, Alzheimer's or dementia caregivers, and sufferers, because I knew I needed help, and I wasn't going to get help that was anecdotal help from friends, casual acquaintances. I needed professional help because I needed to figure out how to move forward. And
Right.
this therapist did that for me. And what he did that was really good was, he said, look, you've got two things going on. You've got all this emotional side. That's all your history together, all your the term of your relationship, almost 40 years at that point. And you have the day-to-day challenges and the future. And you got to keep these things separate. You can't let them overlap. You have to, on the one hand, be with Judy in the present and be loving and feel the caring and the concern. And that's one thing. But then you also have to plan and research and ask questions and seek answers to the practical day-to-day stuff. And to be able to separate those things out was very important, because that allowed me to put my feelings in one place and put my responsibilities in another place.
Oh, that is good.
Well, I read people's posts, caregivers' posts on, and I say especially, but not exclusively, adult children caring for parents. And the emotional, psychic part is so mixed up with all the functional day-to-day stuff that's why I think they feel like they're being strangled by
Yes.
this this circumstance that they have no control over and that they don't have a fix on. And it needs to be separated out. And it is not easy. I will tell you, I read a lot. And so I read a book not very long ago. It was published last year. Sandeep Jauha, I think is the guy's name, a physician, heart surgeon, very well educated, with two siblings, also physicians, caring for a father. My father's brain, life in the shadow of Alzheimer's. And his father, who was an academic, actually had a career at North Dakota State University, eventually developed Alzheimer's, and his three kids, all medical people, very well educated, were charged with his care. And it was no less challenging for them.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
It was a huge undertaking. Now, they had to move him halfway across the country, had to find a situation for him to be in. And reading the book, in my opinion, there were things they did that I wouldn't have done, that I thought, that doesn't seem like a good option. One part of that was leaving their father in the care of an immigrant woman who was much smaller than him, who really couldn't manage him physically, and was actually vulnerable because he would get angry and, you know, he would strike out. But basically, I'm saying it doesn't matter what your background is. It is challenging.
Right.
You know? And so the further ahead you plan, the further ahead, or the earlier you do the research you're going to need down the line, starting with home health. If you can afford to bring somebody into your home for 10 hours a week, so figure out where those people are going to come from. Go visit the agencies, talk to these people, see what the fit feels like for you and for your loved one. And then start small. You know, bring the person in 2 hours a week so your loved one begins to feel comfortable, you know. But it's never should be left to a crisis, because in a crisis, your solution is not going to be long-term. It isn't going to be enduring.
That's so smart. Well, thank you for being here today.
Great pleasure. Great meeting you, Michelle, and talking with you, and appreciate your work. It's important work, so keep it going.
Michael, thank you so much for being with me here today and sharing the story of caring for your wife, Judy. And I really encourage people to dive further into this love story and the wisdom that Michael has shared with us today in his book titled Dear Judy, A Love Story Rewritten by Alzheimer's.